Hello and welcome to our lecture about basic nutrition. Our lecture will be comprised of the following objectives. We will be discussing the overview of nutrition, the energy requirements in humans, and the macronutrients, including the dietary fats, carbohydrates, and protein. So, let us start with the overview of nutrition. Basically, when we talk about nutrition, we are dealing about nutrients, which are constituents of food that are necessary to sustain normal functions of the body. And food is important because these are substances that, when are taken into the body, they provide materials for growth and repair of worn out tissues. They also provide material for heat and energy purposes. They form part of the body composition, and they are indispensable to normal health, and they are not injurious to the body. But if it is given in large amounts, it can lead to some disease like kidney disease due to the end product of protein metabolism, which is urea, that can be eliminated only through the kidneys. So, like what I've mentioned, nutrients are constituents of food that are necessary for the body to sustain its normal function. And the energy is provided from three classes of macronutrients. These are the carbohydrates, the fats, and the protein, which are macronutrients. And they're called macronutrients because they are needed to maintain optimum health and prevent chronic diseases in adults. Then we also have the other food essentials, which are the fatty acids, essential amino acids, vitamins, and minerals, which are called micronutrients. So we also have what we call the dietary reference intake. Basically, these are estimates of the amount of nutrients that is required to prevent deficiencies and maintain the optimal health and growth. So this establishes the upper limits of the consumption of some nutrients, and this incorporates the role of nutrients in lifelong health. Now, the DRI consists of four dietary reference standards for the intake of nutrients, which is designated for a specific life stage, physical state, and gender. And these are the four dietary reference standards, which we will be tackling specifically. The first component of the DRI is the estimated average requirement. So this is the average daily nutrient intake level that is estimated to meet the requirement of one half of the healthy individuals in a particular life stage and gender group. Now this is useful in estimating the actual requirements in groups and individuals. Comparing that with recommended dietary allowance, this is the average daily dietary intake level that is sufficient to meet the requirement nutrients or requirements of nearly all individuals in a specific life stage and gender group. Now, the RDA, this is not the minimal requirement for healthy individuals, but this is intentionally set to provide a margin of safety for most individuals. Next is the adequate intake. This is set instead of the RDA if we don't have sufficient evidence to use for calculation. Now, adequate intake is set or based on estimates of nutrient intake by a group or groups of apparently healthy people. Like, for example, the adequate intake for young infants is based on the estimated mean nutrient intake supplied by human milk for a healthy and full-term infants who are exclusively breastfed. Then we have the tolerable upper intake level. Now, this is the highest average daily nutrient intake level that is likely to pose no risk of adverse health effects to almost all the individuals in the general population. Now, as the intake of a person increases above the upper level, the potential risk of adverse effects may increase. Now let's talk about the energy requirements in humans. So, when we say estimated energy requirement, this is the average dietary energy intake that is predicted to maintain an energy balance in a healthy adult of a certain age, gender, and height, whose weight and the level of physical activity are consistent with good health. So, differences in genetics, metabolism, and behavior will also be factors for us to have difficulty in predicting a person's caloric requirements. But certain approximations have been used for calculation. Like, for example, for sedentary adults, they require about 30 kilocalories rather per kilogram per day. For moderately active adults, they require about 35 kilocalories per kilogram per day. And for very active adults, they require about 40 kilocalories per kilogram per day. Now we have the energy content of food, or also known as the energy factor. So this is calculated from the heat that is released by the total combustion of food in a calorimeter. Now this is expressed in kilocalories. So when we say energy content or energy factor, this refers to the amount of calories that an individual should be allowed per day to supply his requirements for energy. So this is measured in terms of calories that is yielded per gram of the foodstuff. Now, the caloric value of foodstuff is seen in this picture right here. So proteins, it will yield 4 calories per gram. For carbohydrates, it will yield 4 calories per gram. And fat, it will yield 9 calories per gram. So the daily intake or the daily caloric intake can be computed from determining the amount that is needed daily of the three foodstuff which I've mentioned, and we multiply that by the corresponding caloric yield per gram. Now, what is the use of this food energy in the body? So, the energy that is generated by the metabolism of the macronutrients is used for certain processes that occur in the body. And the processes in the body are the following. So, we have the resting metabolic rate, the physical activity, and the thermic effect of food. Now, the total energy expenditure basically is the number of calories that is expended or that is used by these three processes in a 24-hour period. So as you can see in this diagram here, it shows us an estimated total energy expenditure in a healthy 20-year-old woman with the following height, weight, and level of physical activity. So it is divided into these three metabolic processes which require the food energy. So first, let us discuss the resting metabolic rate. The resting metabolic rate is the energy that is used by an individual in a resting or post-absorptive state. So the patient or the individual is not doing anything. So this is just the energy that is used by the body to carry out its normal functions, just like in respiration, blood flow, ion transport, and etc. And the values in RMR is about 10% higher than the basal metabolic rate. Now, the RMR is kind of different with basal metabolic rate in the way that they are determined. For basal metabolic rate, the body is still in a resting state. However, the computation and the calculation is determined under more stringent conditions. So, we determine the oxygen consumption of the body, the production of carbon dioxide, and it can also be estimated using equations that include sex and age. Now, the commonly used rough estimate that nutritionists and doctors use is the following. So, the basal metabolic rate for women is about zero point 0.9 kilocalories per kilogram per hour, and for men, it is about 1 kilocalories per kilogram per hour. Now, the difference is for resting metabolic rate, their values is a little bit higher than BMR. So for a 24-hour RMR, we call that as the resting energy expenditure. So this is the energy that is used by the body in a resting state. So for men who weighs about 70 kilograms, the body will need 1,800 kilocalories for it to carry out normal bodily functions. While for women weighing 50 kilograms, it will use up 1,300 kilocalories. So here, this is just a table to further differentiate the basal metabolic rate from the resting metabolic rate. Then the next factor affecting the total energy expenditure of a person is the level of physical activity. Now, basically, the physical activity talks about the amount of energy that is consumed or used by a person depending on the duration and the intensity of exercise that he or she does. So, the muscular activity or the physical activity provides the greatest variation in the total energy expenditure of a person. So, a person may be sedentary, does not exercise at all, or does moderately active exercise, let's say maybe 3 to 5 times in a week, etc. So, the daily expenditure of the energy can be estimated carefully by recording the type and the duration of all activities to determine the physical activity factor. So, in general, a sedentary person would require 30 to 50% more calories than his resting metabolic rate. But for a person that is highly active, so does work out every day, it will require 100% or more calories above the RMR to support the body functions. Next, we have the thermic effect of food. Now, this is also termed as diet-induced thermogenesis. Basically, this is the production of heat by the body, which increases about 30% above the resting level. Now, this is helpful, or this is made possible because of food digestion and absorption. However, this will only amount to 5 to 10% of the total energy expenditure. So, if you're planning to lose weight, it won't be ideal if you will just depend on the thermic effect of food, because it will only use up 5 to 10% of the calories that you have eaten. So remember that you have the RMR and the physical activity that you have to consider. So here in this slide, I'm showing you one of the most common formula that nutritionists and doctors use to calculate the daily caloric intake of their patients. Now, here is what we call the Harris-Benedict equation, and this is the formula used to compute basal metabolic rate. So we have a different formula for women and men, and we're just going to substitute the values according to the number in weight, height, and the age of the patient. So after we get the basal metabolic rate, next thing that we will find is the active metabolic rate, or AMR. This talks about the level of physical activity that the person does. So it depends if the person is sedentary, like the active, etc. So basically, when you get both of these values, the basal metabolic rate and the active metabolic rate, that is the level or the amount of kilocalories that your body burns while at rest, plus the level of physical activity that you do. So, how about for people who want to lose weight? So, maybe you have heard of the term calorie deficit. So, what does that mean? So, for a person to lose weight, remember that 1 pound of fat is equal to 3,500 calories. So, what would you want to do if you want to lose weight? So, for you to be able to lose 1 pound a week, you must create about 500 calorie deficit each day. So, it's either you eat 500 calories less per day, or you subtract 250 calories from your AMR and you aim to burn 250 calories or more through exercise per day. So let's say you have a 500 calorie deficit per day and you do this for the entire week. So 500 calories times 7, so you have burned 3,500 calories in that certain week. So you were able to lose 1 pound of fat. So that is what we meant by calorie deficit. So what about macronutrient distribution? So again, when we say the macronutrients, we're talking about the carbohydrates, proteins, and fat that we eat in our foodstuff. So here are the acceptable macronutrient distribution ranges, which basically defined as a range of intake for a particular macronutrient that is associated with a reduced risk of chronic disease while providing adequate amounts of essential nutrients. So for carbohydrates, the AMDR for adults is about 45 to 65%. For fats, adults should only have an intake of 20 to 35%, and 10 to 35% of the intake should be from proteins. So now that we have discussed the acceptable macronutrient distribution ranges, first let us talk about dietary fats. So just to recap, so we have what we call lipoproteins. Now, lipoproteins, these are substances found in the body that help in the transport or in the absorption of cholesterol. Now, we have two types. We have the low density and the high density lipoproteins. So, when we say low density proteins, these are the lipoproteins that transport the cholesterol going to the peripheral tissues. While high-density lipoproteins, they absorb the cholesterol from the peripheral tissues and it transports it to the liver. So if you think of it this way, the high-density lipoproteins are also considered as the good cholesterol since it tries to absorb the cholesterol. As you can see here, the bad cholesterol, which is the LDL, the cholesterol is found in the blood vessels and in the peripheral tissues, causing blockage of airways and other tissues and blood vessels. So, elevated levels of total cholesterol is dangerous because it increases the risk of coronary heart disease. So, when we say coronary heart disease, it probably means that there is a complete or partial blockage of an artery or any part of the coronary circulation. So, once that happens, the heart will not be able to pump properly and it will not be contracting as well. So, as LDL will increase, meaning as the bad cholesterol increases, the risk for the coronary heart disease also increases. While if we have more HDL in the body, it decreases the or the coronary heart disease risk as it transports the cholesterol to the liver. So, what are the dietary fats? So, we have already talked about lipids, carbohydrates, and proteins in our previous lectures. So, we will not be tackling the specifics of them because we have already discussed them. So, here we have the triglycerides. So, quantitatively, these are the most important class of dietary fats. So, the influence of triglycerides on the blood lipids is determined by the chemical nature of their constituent fatty acids. So, again, we have the three types of or three structural features of the fatty acids. We have the saturated fats, monounsaturated fats, and the polyunsaturated fats. So just to recap, saturated fats, these are triglycerides that are composed of fatty acids whose hydrocarbon chains do not contain double bonds. So the main sources of saturated fats are dairy, meat products, vegetable oils, and the effects are the following. So they increase the plasma cholesterol. They also increase the low density lipoprotein. So because these are factors that increase the risk of CHD, it is not advisable to have an intake rich in saturated fats. So that's why the recommendation should only be at less than 10% of a person's total caloric intake. Then we have the monounsaturated fats. These are triglycerides containing primarily of fatty acids with one double bond. So the unsaturated fatty acids, they are generally derived from vegetables and fish. And when they are substituted for saturated fatty acids in the diet, the monounsaturated fats, are also termed as MUFA, they lower both the total plasma cholesterol and the low density lipoprotein. And they also maintain or increase the levels of high density lipoprotein. So, this ability of the MUFA to modify the lipoprotein levels is best exhibited by people in the Mediterranean. So their diet is rich in olive oil, so it's high in monounsaturated fats. So these people, they have low incidence of coronary heart disease because of the effects of MUFA. So the recommendation for monounsaturated fats is about 50% of the total fat intake. So here is the Mediterranean diet. So this is an example of a diet that is rich in monounsaturated fatty acids and polyunsaturated fatty acids. So basically, the diet contains seasonally fresh food, abundance of plant material, and low amounts of red meat, and there is olive oil as their primary source of fat. So the Mediterranean diet is associated with a decrease in the serum cholesterol, low density lipoprotein, and decreased triglycerides. And it also increases the high density lipoprotein when compared with a typical Western diet that is higher in saturated fats. So you can see here in this diagram, we have here the typical Mediterranean diet and the typical Western diet. So as you can see, it has the same percentage of fat, which is 38%, same with the Western diet. But you've noticed here that for a Mediterranean diet, it has a high amount of monounsaturated fatty acids, comparing to the Western diet wherein the saturated fatty acid is more or less equal to that of the monounsaturated fatty acid. Next are the polyunsaturated fats. So these are triglycerides composed of fatty acids with more than one double bond. So the effects of the polyunsaturated fatty acids um, is influenced by the location of the double bonds within the molecule. So we have discussed this in our previous lecture. So we have the omega-6 fatty acids and the omega-3 fatty acids. So please review yourselves with why they are named omega-6 and omega-3. So basically, we start counting from the methyl end, and the first double bond beginning at the sixth, like here, at the sixth bond position, are named omega-6 fatty acids. So starting from here, so we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And then here for omega-3, we have 1, 2, and 3. So those are the fatty acids. So here are the main classes of the polyunsaturated fatty acids. So the omega-6 fatty acids, principally the consumption of these fats, especially linoleic acid, they are obtained from vegetable oils. So these fatty acids, it lowers plasma cholesterol when it's substituted for saturated fats, and the plasma low density lipoproteins are lowered, but the high density lipoprotein is also lowered. So since HDL was supposed to be a good cholesterol, somehow the benefits of lowering the LDL are only partially offset because the HDL is also increased. So the sources for omega-6 fatty acids are the following. So nuts, avocados, olives, soybeans, and etc. So the daily requirement for omega-6 is about 5 to 10% in the diet. Next, we have the omega-3 fatty acids. So this is helpful because they help in suppressing cardiac arrhythmias, they reduce the serum triglyceride levels, they also decrease thrombotic events, it helps in lowering the blood pressure, and has anti-inflammatory effects. So the sources for omega-3 fatty acids are linolenic acid, which is seen in plant oils, flaxseed, canola, and nuts. So here's just a diagram to show you the amount of saturated or unsaturated fat depending on the foodstuff that is consumed by a certain person. Next, we have the trans fatty acids. So these are chemically classified as unsaturated fatty acids, but they behave more like saturated fatty acids in the sense that they elevate the LDL but not HDL. So because of that, they increase the risk of CHD. So this is not naturally occurring in plants, but in small amounts it is present in animals. And the major source of trans fatty acids are formed during hydrogenation of liquid vegetable oils, like for the manufacture of margarine. So this is a major component of commercial baked goods like cookies, cakes, and deep fried food. So if you want to watch out for your health and not gain too much weight, so I suggest that the intake for your trans fatty acids should not be more than what is recommended. So this table, I lifted this from the Lippincot's biochemistry book. So this basically just sums up the type of fat, its metabolic effects, and its effects on disease prevention. Next are the dietary carbohydrates. So here are the dietary carbohydrates. So we've already discussed carbohydrates in a previous lecture, so I won't be going over them one by one. So basically, the primary role of dietary carbohydrate is to provide energy, and it is classified as either complex or simple sugars and fiber. So for monosaccharides, we have the glucose and fructose, which are found abundant in fruits, sweet corn, corn syrup, and honey. And then we also have the disaccharides. So the disaccharides, the most abundant are sucrose, lactose, and maltose. And then we have the polysaccharides. So the polysaccharides, these are complex carbohydrates that do not have a sweet taste. So example for that is starch, which is found in plants. And then we also have wheat and other grains, potatoes, dried peas, beans, and vegetables. And then we have fiber. So fiber is defined as the non-digestible, non-starch carbohydrates that are present in plants. So we have two types. We have the soluble and insoluble fiber. So soluble fiber, this is the edible part of the plant that is resistant to digestion and absorption in the human small intestine, but it can be completely or partially fermented by bacteria to short chain fatty acids in the large intestine. Then we also have the insoluble fiber. So this insoluble fiber, it passes through the digestive tract largely intact. So the dietary fiber, it provides little energy, but it has several beneficial effects. So here are just some of the effects of fiber. So first, it adds bulk to the diet. So the fiber can absorb about 10 to 15 times its own weight in water. So it draws the fluid into the lumen of the intestine, and it also increases the bowel motility and promotes normal laxation. For soluble fiber, the soluble fiber also helps in delaying gastric emptying. So this can result in a sensation of fullness. Now, this delayed emptying also results in reduced peaks of blood glucose following a meal. Another important effect of fiber is that it lowers the LDL levels by increasing the fecal bile acid excretion and interfering with bile acid absorption. So, for example, diets that are rich in soluble fiber oat bran, they're associated with reduction in the risk for CHD as it lowers total cholesterol and LDL. Also, fiber-rich diets, they decrease the risk for constipation, hemorrhoids, and diverticulosis. So the allowable intake for dietary fiber is about 25 grams per day for women and 38 grams per day for men. So, what are the requirements for carbohydrates? So, carbohydrates, they're actually not essential nutrients because the carbon skeleton of most amino acids can be converted into glucose. However, if there is absence of dietary carbohydrate, this can lead to ketone body production and degradation of proteins because the more the amino acids are converted, the more proteins are lost in the body. So the recommended dietary allowance for carbohydrate is about 130 grams per day in adults and children. And this is based on the amount of glucose that is used by carbohydrate dependent tissues such as the brain and the red blood cells. And remember that for adults, they should consume 45 to 65% of their total calories from carbohydrates. And it is recommended that the added sugar represents no more than 25% of the total energy. Then we have the dietary proteins. So humans, we have no dietary requirement for proteins per se, but the protein does provide essential amino acids. So we have already discussed in our previous lessons the essential and non-essential proteins. So kindly review yourself which amino acids are considered essential, meaning they're important in the diet because they're not synthesized in our body. So, what are the sources for dietary protein? So, we have the animal and the plant sources. So, for the proteins coming from animal sources, these are found in meat, poultry, milk, and fish. And they have a high quality because they contain all the essential amino acids in proportions similar to those required for the synthesis of human tissue proteins. And other than that, they are more readily digested than proteins found in plant sources. So next, we have the plant sources. So protein is also found in wheat and in kidney beans. So even if it's important, it is of a lower quality than those protein present in animal meat. However, proteins from different plant sources may be combined in such a way that the result is equivalent in the nutritional value to that of the animal protein. One important concept that has to be reviewed for the dietary proteins is nitrogen balance. So, this is the condition which occurs when the amount of nitrogen consumed is equal to the level of nitrogen being excreted in the urine, sweat, or feces. So, if we say that the body is in a positive nitrogen balance, it means that the intake of nitrogen is more than the nitrogen being excreted. So this happens in situations wherein there is tissue growth, like during childhood, pregnancy, or recovery from emaciating illness. And then we have negative nitrogen balance. So this occurs when the nitrogen loss is greater than the nitrogen intake. So this may happen if there is malnutrition, so there is inadequate intake of protein, there's lack of essential amino acids, or during physiologic stress like trauma, burns, illness, or surgery. So, what are the requirements for proteins in humans? So, the amount of dietary protein required in the diet varies with its biologic value. So, the greater the proportion of animal protein included in the diet, the less protein is required. So, the recommended daily allowance for protein is computed for proteins of mixed biologic value. So it is around zero point 0.8 grams per kilo for a 70 kilo individual. For athletes, they may require or they may need about 1 gram per kilogram as they exercise strenuously. So they will benefit for a more extra protein in their diet to maintain their muscle mass. And then for pregnant and lactating women, and also for infants, their basal requirements is a little bit higher to support growth. Now, we have mentioned that in some countries or in some situations, there is malnutrition, whether there is a lack in the protein or in the caloric intake of patients. So, PEM or protein energy malnutrition, this is usually seen in patients with medical conditions where their appetite is decreased or the digestion or the absorption of their nutrients is altered. This is also seen in hospitalized patients with major trauma or infections, and also for those malnourished children or the elderly population. However, in developed countries, the primary cause of PEM is the inadequate intake of protein or calorie in the diet. So, when there is a deficit of protein in the diet, this can actually cause a depressed immune system. So there is a reduced ability to resist infection. So these patients, they are highly susceptible to infections, inflammations, and other disease conditions. So we have two extreme forms of malnutrition involving a deficit in the protein or in the calorie intake of patients. So we have kwashiorkor and marasmus. So, kwashiorkor, this is a condition that occurs when the protein deprivation is relatively greater than the reduction in total calories. So, this is associated with a severely decreased synthesis of visceral protein. And kwashiorkor is commonly seen in developing countries in children after weaning at about 1 year old. So when we say weaning, meaning after they're weaned off from breastfeeding or from bottle feeding. So after they're weaned, their diet is replaced by predominantly carbohydrates. So the symptoms for kwashiorkor is that these children, they will manifest with stunted growth, skin lesions, depigmented hair, anorexia, enlarged liver, and edema. So since there is a lack of blood proteins, now we've mentioned this in our previous lectures as well. So if there's less blood proteins in the blood vessel, so there's less force keeping the blood and the fluid inside the blood vessel. So what happens? The fluid goes out into the interstitial fluid, causing edema. So as you can see in this patient right here, they have an enlarged abdomen, or they have what we call the condition ascites. The other type is marasmus. Marasmus occurs when the calorie deprivation is relatively greater than the reduction in protein. So this occurs in developing countries in children younger than 1 year old when breast milk is being supplemented by water gruels of native cereals. So they're not getting enough nutrients from the milk that they're getting since they're substituted by a low calorie watery gruels. So it's deficient in both protein and calories. So symptoms are the following. So these children, they will manifest with arrested growth, extreme muscle wasting, and loss of subcutaneous fat like here. And in comparison with kwashiorkor, they do not manifest with edema. So here is a table showing us the difference between kwashiorkor and marasmus. So thank you for your attention. I hope that you were able to learn from this lecture. And I've lifted my lecture from Lippincott's Illustrated Reviews of Biochemistry 6th edition. So kindly read the corresponding chapter for this lecture. And remember, you don't need to see the whole staircase. Just take the first step. Thank you and happy studying.